Hi, standoff. And Artem Sinitsyn is coming to us once again. He's going to talk to us about bug bounty from Microsoft. Artem, the floor is yours. Thank you, Ivan. Thank you very much. Hi, once again. Thank you so much for taking interest in my presentation. And I'm going to start by remind you that cybersecurity landscape constantly changes. New TNTs, tactics and techniques constantly come by, and by informing Microsoft on vulnerabilities through coordinated vulnerability disclosure, you as a community help us to protect millions of customers across the globe, and we keep improving on our bug bounty programs and improve the community thanks to security researchers. I'm still Artem Sinitsyn. I'm still managing security programs in Central and Eastern Europe, and in the nearest hour, I'm going to acquaint you with programs, bug bounty programs, not just one program. I'll start with brief history of Microsoft and when we registered first vulnerability and got first CVE identifier, so that you understand how vast our experience is in this respect. Next, we'll obviously look into the existent bug bounty programs at products and services that we have. We're going to answer the questions whether or not Microsoft supports bug bounty that only have to do with cloud services. We're going to touch upon recommendations on how to report vulnerabilities correctly, what to expect when reporting vulnerabilities to Microsoft, and what needs to be studied and researched into before you submit the report, so that we form your expectations, and what happens after you submit your report. And we also have a look at the procedure, high-level look at the procedure. We'll also look into compensation schemes, how much you can earn, and what is the part of this program that has to do with remuneration of security researchers that file vulnerability reports to us, all kinds of ratings and scores and all that. And then we'll have a Q&A session. Start writing the questions to chat, because Ivan can follow the chat, unlike myself. All through the presentation, please feel free to ask questions, and then closer to the end of the presentation, I'll answer those questions. Should I fail to answer some of your questions because of time limitations, let me remind you that at 5, we're going to have Ask Me Anything session where myself and Mr. Kirill Bogdanov will devote exactly 1 hour to answer any question. If you have a question on one of the two presentations that I'm making today, I'll be more than happy to answer those. So let us start. What has changed? The year 2020, the crazy 2020 at Microsoft, we constantly are involved in looking into the threat landscape, and we listen to security researchers quite attentively so as to be very effective in data exchange between the community of security researchers and Microsoft as a vendor, as a vendor of client service systems and premise installations, and one of the leaders in terms of cloud solutions. So this year, Microsoft launched 6 new bug bounty programs, 2 research grants, and we got more than 1,000 reports from more than 300 experts from 6 continents. The new bug bounty program, security researchers. So on this plot, you can see here that the history of registering vulnerabilities in CVE base with CVE identifiers started long ago, back in 1998. And the most relevant thing is the right-hand part of this plot, demonstrating to us that in the last 5 years, the number of vulnerability went up dramatically. Those are vulnerabilities identified and closed by Microsoft. And this is comparison year on year. Now it's above 1,000 vulnerabilities, first in history. So on the one hand, there is this opinion that the number of reports filed within the framework of our bug bounty programs has to do with the pandemic, with COVID-19 pandemic. That is to say, COVID researchers have more time to carry out the researches, and correspondingly, we get more of these researchers. But I do believe that, on the other hand, on our side, the vendor side, that's because our bug bounty programs keep developing. We now have 15 bug bounty programs, so you have a vast choice. So let us now talk about them. But before that, let me remind you that we're an official CVE numbering authority. That is to say, Microsoft is the company who is authorized, fully authorized, as a member of this consortium that supports the CVE, the vulnerability database. And the first vulnerability, remember the plot, the previous one, was registered in June 1998. Interestingly, it already had CVE registry number 1999-0007. So actually, a rare case that the vulnerability was registered 6 months before the year it was registered in. So, two records this year. Crazy year 2020. And it's still on. I mean, we're in November. More than 1,000 vulnerabilities closed, and in the last 5 or 6 months, or if not more than 100 vulnerabilities have been patched. So every second Tuesday of month, in the morning of Wednesday, I go in details about it. In the last 6 months, we would always have more than 100. One other thing. Did I miss anything? No, I did not. Let us not spend more time on this one and go right into the main dish of our today's dinner, so to speak. Microsoft bug bounty programs. Starting with the basics, you need to understand who is the owner and who supports bug bounty programs. It's Microsoft Security Response Center, our colleagues. I work with in working with databases. And in particular, prioritization procedure and forming procedure and forming a schedule for patches. And they are the ones who get the reports, and they are the ones who analyze the reports they get from security researchers. So MSRC, they are the ones, yeah. They are the product owner in this case. And I'd like to point out that it is not limited to one particular program. It has to interact with groups, support groups of particular products or cloud service when getting data. And by this, I mean reproducibility, identifying conditions for reproducibility of vulnerability filed by a particular researcher, etc. So, now that we know everything about the product owner, what is bug bounty program? In case you don't know. It's not our initiative. Bug bounty programs is something launched by other vendors. This could be OS system vendors. This could be web resource vendor. It doesn't have to be a player working in cybersecurity industry. So why big bug bounty program? Bug bounty program exists to timely and fast clear out the bugs and patch so as to safeguard the endpoint users. This is looking through at it through the lens of vendors. In terms of security researchers, two benefits come with it. Ivan, can you hear me? Yes, yes, yes. Everything is perfect. Yes. Okay, great. I won't. Then I won't get distracted with my telephone. Okay. So researchers get two kinds of benefits. You either get support and reputation. You get reputational benefit and acknowledgement, and you also can get a monetary reward. It's also it could become part of your portfolio if you're deep into researching, and it's also a monetary reward. You know, it's like here comes the money moment. Most bug bounty includes monetary rewards, and we're going to touch upon this as well because we're no exclusion to that rule. So when it was launched, officially it was launched in 2010. Some people believe that the first announcement was in 2014. It's not true. You can visit our portal and you can see that among the still supported bug bounty programs, there are programs that were launched in 2013 and earlier. So beginning of 2010s, the first decade of the 2000s. One of the peculiar features of bug bounty from Microsoft is that more often than not always, but more often than not, award is only given for highly critical vulnerabilities. In our vulnerability taxonomy, those are critical and important vulnerabilities. There are also moderate and mild vulnerabilities. Critical, important, moderate, and low. So we are looking at critical and important rather than moderate and low. We are looking into timely identification and mitigation, eradication of critical and important vulnerabilities. For critical vulnerability, minimum award is from 15 to 250,000 US dollars. And before going on to the bug bounty programs, I'm trying to follow my term here. So last thing I tell you is that RSMC is only supports the programs that I'm going to refer to later, and RSMC is not the owner. We are not the people you need to register vulnerabilities that have to do with GitHub resource and LinkedIn social network resource. If it's about GitHub or LinkedIn, please address them, not MSRC. Please don't file your reports about vulnerabilities on these resources. Please don't file those resources to us. These are the programs I'm referring to. It's Microsoft Azure that started in 2014 and ongoing. Obviously, we keep going with it. It's among top three biggest. Azure is among top three biggest cloud solutions with infrastructure that provides to our customer the whole range of typical cloud services and beyond, with maximum payment up to 40,000 US dollars. And here, everything that's related to Azure infrastructure. This is cloud infrastructure. Cloud infrastructure-related vulnerabilities. What follows is bug bounty program, comprehensive bug bounty program that has to do with vulnerability related to attacks to compromise credentials. It started in 2018 with maximum award of $100,000 US dollars, and here we mean both commercial and consumer services. Asia Active Directory, authentication of catalogs and all that, anything that could deal with the task of servicing the life cycle of accounts. Consumer Microsoft account in consumer service, should you find any security vulnerability, by any means file the report. Apart from that, this program also covers identifying vulnerabilities and security challenges that have to do with OpenID Connect. So even if you identify fundamental issues in current identification protocols, please report it here. And this has to do with the general way identity safety security is provided. Then Xbox, anything that has to do with our gaming platform, game streaming, Xbox Live identification, vulnerabilities that allow to get control of the titles or games in Xbox Live account, or potentially fraudulent actions that allow to prolong or illegitimately get game passes and all that. So that's what this bug bounty program is about. And with a maximum award of $20,000, it's pretty fresh. It started in January this year. And as you know, platform Xbox Series X has been launched, so it's a very relevant program. Microsoft Online Services started just when Microsoft Azure started in 2014. SaaS application, Office 365, Microsoft 365, so much as it refers to SaaS with maximum payment of up to 20,000 US dollars. Microsoft Azure DevOps Services, the cloud part of it. There's also Azure DevOps Server. It's something new. It's a new round of developing ITFS server. It's something different. So it has to do with cloud only. Exists for 2 years. Award of up to 20,000 USD awaits you. Microsoft Dynamics 365, and obviously, last but not least, Microsoft.NET Core and ASP.NET Core. Let me remind you that this platform with open source, supported by on GitHub with maximum payment, maximum award of up to 15,000 US dollars. Azure and Microsoft's service, and this last one are the oldest programs. Onto the ground. The previous things were related to the cloud. Some people say that we do not develop a bug bounty for platform on-premise products. This is not true. These are our bug bounty programs related to that. The most interesting part is obviously Hyper-V. Hackers all around the world are interested in hacking Hyper-V. Hyper-V includes not just the hypervisor, sorry for this digression, but all the components that have to do with Hyper-V. So this program started in the middle of 2017, and this bug bounty program has an upper threshold award of 250,000 USDs. So the most critical vulnerabilities are the ones that allow us to break hardware isolation and get unauthorized access to critically important elements. Speaking of customers, Microsoft Windows Insiders preview also launched in 2017. That's where researchers can download built inside the preview, identify vulnerability and report it. If we submit it, then before it goes into general availability, this could be patched. And you can see that the payment is handsome, up to 100,000 US dollars, second best in terms of in terms of award, in terms of the bill that you can get. Nobody is nobody is saying thereby that we're not looking into platform programs. Not just the platform, but also various components that allows to secure this platform. Also is covered by bug bounty program. Application Guard, for example. In my first presentation today, I was talking about different guards. Application Guard, you probably don't know, is the technology that allows you to isolate two scenarios, two popular scenarios. The one to drop payload, to inject payload into a potential victim. The adversary hijacked web resource and using social engineering to click a link and go to a site with unpatched version of something. This is number one. And number two, using emails with specially prepared attachments or access that is masked as a document. So application guard is the thing that allows to you can actually do it automatically to launch browser in a hardware isolated address space, and thus compromising it is impossible. Even if Excel with malicious Excel with malicious macros is open, the malware only gets as far as the sandbox. So if you find a way to escape this sandbox, not just Hyper-V, but something that has to do with the application guard sandbox, then the payment, the maximum award for finding this vulnerability is up to $30,000. Apart from Hyper-V and application guard, it has to do with Microsoft Edge for Chromium-based, with Chromium-based. Edge has been developed and designed initially in close contact with our colleagues from Google. And since it's based on Chromium engine, Google is also interested to see that the browsers built on their engine provides with the most secure working conditions. So Microsoft and our OSR group has seen instances where members of Microsoft team have informed on vulnerabilities, and those were patched. And patches to Microsoft Edge Chromium-based is very much dependent on registering and accounting for vulnerabilities in Chromium engine. So it's not every second Tuesday, but it's a different life cycle. And obviously Office, just as with Windows and Windows Server, if you find vulnerabilities in Office Insider, be this mail client or any other client, please report those vulnerabilities and get up to 15,000 US dollars reward. And when we're talking about Windows, it's Insider Premium. In this case, it's not just about stable releases, but also the dev and the beta tester. Last but not least are defense programs. The key peculiarity of these programs is that rather than covering specific products and services, they have to do with reports that describe the ways to bypass the existing security mechanisms that lead to considerable breach and decrease in a product or system security. Mitigation, bypass, and bounty for defense program consists of two parts. In the first case, you can provide a scenario that allows to bypass one of the technologies that is in charge of one layer. Layered defense presupposes that you have several, obviously, layers. And if your report refers to bypassing one layer without recommendation as to how to patch it, how to mitigate this threat vector, you can still file this report, although your report will be smaller. If, on the other hand, you inform how not only about the vulnerability but also how to mitigate this bypass, you get a greater award up to $100,000. Like I said, two parts, right? If you only describe a reproducible scenario for a bypass, then it's up to 100. If you also provide us with an effective way of mitigating this risk, then you may get additionally another $100,000. And very new grant Microsoft Identity Program 2020, getting up to $75,000 award, and it has to do ways to improve the protocols, the specifications, and components in charge of realizing security functions and tasks related to identity, Microsoft account lifecycle management. So you develop your own realizations, your own instances, and you may get a grant. So 15 programs, almost all of them. I mean, we cover almost everything, with the only exclusion of old browsers. But Explorer is part of an OS, and the life cycle of OS is not finished yet, is still going. So how to report an issue? Earlier, historically, you could just email it to alias of MSRC Center. But our colleagues recommend, they say it unambiguously, that the best and, quite frankly, the only way is to register in a portal, web portal. The link is on the slide. Standard form, and you need to include all the details. Colleagues may ask you, or you may include the POC video, proof of concept video. You also have recommendations and examples of best practice, best reports, like when you would come to a governmental agency to get a public service, you would get the way the forms should be filled. Well, this is exactly that. You can get to know how these forms should be filled. We have correspondence information on this portal. And most importantly, you may want to file different requests depending on type of vulnerability. In particular, if you're describing a very different, considerably different threat vectors, or you touch upon various functions of a particular component, then it would be best to delineate those reports and send them separately. What else? Oh, and going forward, the quality of your reports I mean, should you plan to interact with Microsoft within bug bounty program? In this case, you get a track. I mean, the better the quality, the higher the quality of your reports, the better the reputation benefit. So there is direct correlation between the way our MSRC colleagues take you and I mean, it's not just about frequency, it's also about the extent to which it's critical and the speed of filing reports. Actually, speed is important because even if you are not the first to register vulnerability, you can still count on certain benefits. I'll talk about it later in this presentation. What needs to be done before you even start investing your effort and resource, your time resource into identifying vulnerabilities and filing reports within bug bounty programs from Microsoft. All the information security problems should be in line with definitions, security vulnerability definitions. Here we follow MITRE standards, MITRE definitions. So this has to be a weakness in information security. This is important because otherwise your vulnerability report will be rejected. Otherwise, it's rejected. So please make sure that you understand everything correctly and that your report complies with this definition. And it's not the only conditions. And later on, we'll see additional conditions that impact decision on rejecting your presentation or confirming the vulnerability and working on patch and awarding the security researcher who filed the correspondent report. So we start with the definition. What goes next? Before you file your report, you need to answer two questions. These two questions form the criteria for maintaining, supporting, and creating patches. So what are these questions? Does the vulnerability start again? If the security problem that you describe in your report touches on processes such as crossing security boundary, so if it has the intent of violating the security boundary, or is it is this vulnerability aimed at meeting the bar for servicing? So, does the vulnerability violate the goal or intent of a security boundary or security feature? And even if the vulnerability is deemed critical, does the severity of this vulnerability meet the bar for servicing? That is to say, even if you answer yes to the first question and you answer no to the second question, then your application is rejected. In order for your application not to be rejected, you want a case manager to answer yes to each of the two questions. And for you to save time, you'd rather ask these questions to yourself before you publish your report. You can see here a hyperlink to Windows security servicing criteria that describes it all in all the details. It includes it also has a link to servicing bar, and if it's is not if it is below the servicing bar, then it may be rejected. And now let's go into the details of what security servicing criteria is all about. It's split it into several elements, and let me let me show it in the portal. Okay, you should see it now. Right, you're right. So here is my browser. This is Microsoft Edge on Chromium, by the way, for you to know. So you can see security servicing criteria, these two questions that I just voiced. So do look at our servicing bar, and let's have a look at the examples. I talked of security boundary and security features. Whether or not the intent is to violate security boundary and security features. This is a very important term. You may believe, your understanding may be, or experts from other companies may believe, that security boundary is something different. But the thing is that if you participate in Microsoft bug bounty, you have to go with the definition that we have in Microsoft. So let's start with security boundary. To give you a typical example of what is and what is not a security boundary, here is the list of what is a security boundary. Let's have a look. Network level and authorized network endpoint access at the kernel level as well, kernel boundary. Here I'd like to point out specifically that if you're describing a behavior where the user mode process gets access to the data structure in the kernel mode, then it's a breach of security boundary, the isolation boundary between the user mode and the kernel mode. Then process boundary, obviously. Here we have software realized processes, software realized ways of isolation. App container sandbox. App container is one of the ways to go about it. As you know, something from Microsoft Store is automatically launched in app container. User-defined fonts that are oftentimes used by attackers also are launched in Sandbox first. And if you prove that you can get access from Sandbox to the resources, then it would be violation of app container sandbox boundary. User boundary, if the user gets access to user data of other users. Session boundary, but browser boundary, virtual machine boundary. Obviously, virtual machines should not access resources of each other. It has to do with Hyper-V, Hyper-V, obviously, and virtual secure mode boundary, or VSM. I've been talking about it for about an hour this morning. So VSM is about hybrid software-hardware isolation between critical processes such as local security application subsystem, LSS. So if you prove that when you launch Mimikatz utility or any other such like utility, and when you have a local administrator privileges with LSA isolated, and when it works as LSA ISO, and you still manage to steal data with Mimikatz or similar utility from LSA ISO rather than hijacking them when they're on the way from LSA to LSA ISO, then this would be proof of concept breach of boundary. But most interestingly, what is not violation of boundary? Any other container technology, Dockers and all that, we were not planning to isolate those resources completely. So they have permeable boundaries. rather than isolating kernels, they isolate certain parts. So, long story short, they were not supposed to have their own boundary. So, what we mean is the hardware isolated containers that has to do with Hyper-V and virtual secure mode. Also, administrator to kernel. Here in Windows, it's well known that if you have local administrator rights, then you have full control over the system. And if you launch something in terms of kernel mode, then everything is okay. It's not a violation. It's not boundary violation. It's very important. If you're saying that Mimikatz utility steals data from USA, but in order to do that, you have to go to escalate your privilege all the way to administrator, then it's not applicable to bug bounty program because there is no violation of boundary. Or Hyper-V administrator group. It's a special dedicated group to sustain Hyper-Visa lifecycle. If you manage a Hyper-Visa lifecycle, then de facto you manage the whole system. So if an account is used to compromise, it's not a violation of boundary, security boundary. To close this particular part, I'd like to point out that probably it might surprise you, but Active Directory domain is not a security boundary. If when you get control of account in Active Directory and you get control of tree, then it's not security boundary violation. The tree is the forest is the boundary violation. So next is important to look at features. It can not only violate boundaries, but also violate features, security feature in terms of control and management of security. Here we have BitLocker, security feature, secure boot, measures boot, etc. Also, one other example is Windows Defender System Guard. It also is about bypassing the code integrity policy. Windows Defender Operations Control is here as well. The difference is that in WDSG, we are looking at the code integrity at the user level, while in WDIC, it's on the kernel level. Then if you find vulnerability in Windows Hello biometrics, great. If Windows Resource Access Control, obviously, if you don't have an opportunity for access, then realizing this access means that you found a vulnerability. If it's in platform cryptography, next generation, cryptography API, next generation CNG, great. Health attestation. Here we use host guardian service. It also, here the program is applicable as well. It's within the scope of the program. And yet another thing that is not as easy as the previous one when you have black and white kind of situation, it has to do with a layered protection. Each of these mechanisms is not used as necessary and sufficient for security. It only works in combination with other mechanisms. And by compromising one of these mechanisms, you also need to prove that the rest are compromised. An important example, user account control is not security boundary. It's one of the digital defense in depth aspect. If you identify vulnerability to bypass your act, then you don't file it. It's not interesting. Same to do with app locker. Bypass of app locker was more or less privileged. Access is not within bug bounty program scope. Control folder access that allows to increase the time of attack with ransomware is it's a compensating mechanism in Windows 10. It's not a standalone mechanism. It only works being complemented with something else. So should you identify that it's not in bug bounty scope, look at the blue yes in the bounty. If, say, you find a vulnerability in data execution prevention, it's a part of exploit guard in Windows 10, by the way, then intent to servers is no, but you can still get bounty. That is not sufficient, but yet if you find vulnerability, you're still getting a bounty. Or like here, address space layout randomization. There is no intent to service, but yes, you can get bounty. While kernel address space layout randomization, here you are not getting bounty. ICG and CIG, arbitrary code guard, code integrity guard, they are parts of exploit guard in Windows 10, and for some of them you can get bounties, for others not. Safe SEH and CHubs also bounty. Yes, you get bounty, but no, it's not so covered. And exploit guard, which is an umbrella that looks at child process launching and automatic disablement of macroses, of Office formats, documents downloaded from the internet. All that is not in the scope of our bug bounty program. It's important to know. Scenario that I touched upon in my presentation, previous presentation today, I told you that protected process light flags that it's an alarm flag, and it's not within the scope of bug bounty, because in certain conditions, when you use Mimikatz in particular, like I demonstrated today in the morning, you can easily unflag it. But you have to have administrator rights, obviously, in order to do that. Shielded virtual machine from Windows 2016 onwards that allows to carry out platform lockdown, where you cannot get open data, non-encrypted data. Virtual machine is part of layer protection. It's a compensator kind of thing. So it is not part of the program at all. This document is 2 years old, and I do recommend that you study it in all the details before you file your reports, because it potentially saves a lot of your time and never sells. Yet another thing that you can get from this document. Sorry, I think I stopped sharing my screen. No, you still share it. Yet another link. There is a link to Windows Update Servicing bar with description of each class of vulnerabilities for our products, and so you can study it. It's important to look at what's critical and what's important. So you can see here UOPs, and if you look at DDoS, they are also ranked. Transitory DDoS is more critical than, say, I mean, a persistent DDoS is more critical than temporary DDoS or temporary DOS. Let's get back to slides. We don't have much time left. So, I'd rather skip this description of process. Do download the slides. You'll have a link to our official blog where this process is described in all the details, what goes on when you carry out vulnerability triage. It may happen that your application doesn't have a case number and its processing is stopped, but more often than not, that's because you do not meet the criteria. It may not violate the security boundary or a security feature. So triage case, review, develop, release, and complete. Oh, before I forget, reward is paid. I mean, if reward is tied to patch, then the reward is paid on stages release or complete. Next, as far as payment procedure is concerned, this is just to give you an example. In the last year, Microsoft paid awards to the amount of almost $14 million since July 2019 to 30 June 2020. More than 1,000 vulnerability reports processed, 327 researchers awarded, was the biggest award of $200,000. So the bug bounty are programs that gives you the biggest rewards while we pay for this really critical vulnerabilities that you might find. These payments are 3 times greater compared to the payments of the previous similar period, 2018 to 2019. I mean, our total amount is greater than a Google total amount of payment. If somebody tells you that we don't pay enough money, well, here is statistics for you. Google says that it was a very successful year in terms of the number of patches, and their cumulative sum paid out in the form of awards was less than 14 million that we paid. You can find it in the internet. Apart from getting money, it's also about recognition, gaining researcher recognition. And this could be done in 2 ways. Firstly, if researcher doesn't mind, information on who identified this vulnerability is published on Microsoft security updates right into it is written right into the article that describes vulnerability. There's also a security updates guide separate part that enumerates all researchers whose reports were confirmed, for which patches were came out. More often than not, the name of the person is mentioned and also the group name or the company name that he or she represents. Apart from that, MSRC colleagues publish a chart where you have ranks and points. I mean, researchers who gain a great number of points are enumerated here. I don't have enough time to tell you all about it. There are points for reports, and like I said, you better be prepared. And you also have points for reputation. If it's not the first vulnerability that you file, and it's highly critical vulnerabilities, then then you respond to additional information, and you also have the proof of concept videos, then you get highest ranking. And this is tied to the speed in processing your application. If you talk to a particular group or researcher for a while, then their reputation is ranked in the pipe for processing their reports. 55 minutes. Ivan, do we have questions, or shall we invite to join us in our Ask Anything session? Actually, it's pretty quiet in the chat window. Most probably everybody is ready to go and chat with you privately and ask your questions privately. Okay, then do download the slides. I'll have all the links in my Twitter. The minimum package of documents is something that you definitely need to study before you participate in our bug bounty programs. And let me once again remind you that it's best to be on the bright side. Don't go to the dark side. So if you find vulnerability, inform us. Coordinate vulnerability disclosure is great. And we have various ways to award researchers for privately informing us without telling about exploits and vulnerabilities publicly. And don't forget cyber hygiene and safe distancing. Thank you.